This is my first time in PGS, and thanks to Vishala, who invited me over. But in a way, with all esteemed participants today, for me it's a rite of passage into PGS. And very briefly about the work that I do before we get into the presentation. I've been in the policy space for long, but I've also been in organizations that either implemented programs directly or funded initiatives across the world. Just before this, I used to be the executive director of Greenpeace in India. This was when it was raided. I had to leave Greenpeace. But then Greenpeace was also a kind of a learning on what not to do as an organization and as an approach to issues of the environment and climate change. So this presentation is based on my experience for quite some time on agriculture. I've been in the Revitalising Rainfed Agriculture Network, but also very recently initiated something called the India Biochar and Bioresources Network. And this emerged out of RRAN. And so this presentation is going to be from the perspective of public policy. And in Karnataka, through RRAN, RRAN, as you know, is a national network. But in Karnataka, we took a different approach of not going to the chief secretary directly to get policies done, but to actually work with farmers and create the demand from farmers themselves and putting panchayat at the center of transformation. Because the 73rd Amendment of the Constitution and the 11th Schedule of the Constitution very clearly mention, these two, 73rd Amendment and the 11th Schedule, very clearly mention all the issues that we work with. And so it is necessary that we don't create parallel governance structures on the ground, but to very closely work with the panchayats. I've been promoting what is called Akkadi Salu in Karnataka. And Akkadi Salu, the first reference to Akkadi Salu in literature that we discovered, it may have been there even earlier, but the first reference to it is from Santa Sishunala Sharifa, one of the social reformers in Karnataka. I say one of the because each state in India has had many, many social reformers, and social reform in India has also been a political reform in a louder manner. So Santa Shishnala Sharifa talks about Akkadi Salu in the middle of the 19th century. And Akkadi Salu itself is a diversity-based ecological farming practice. And in the 21st century, it's zero chemicals in terms of fertilizers as well as pesticides, and zero groundwater. And in some places for critical irrigation, minimal groundwater. And biomarkers like insects as indicators of the health of the crop. That's Akkadi Salu for us. So Santa Shishnala Sharifa says that just like there is Akkadi Salu in the agricultural field, there should also be an Akkadi Salu kind of social structure or social diversity in the society. This he says in the 19th century in the north of Karnataka. So we saw that there, since its demise, there was not much talk about Akkadi Salu. And, in South Karnataka, we call it Salu Bele, but Salu Bele does not denote the diversity because Salu Bele can just be row cropping, while Akkadi is about diversity. So we started talking to the government about it, and the planning department was very impressed because we did a Krishi Kalamana or a Besaya Kalamana, which is about 1 year calendar of Akkadi Salu and what farmers can do. Of course, the calendar differs a little bit, depending on the agroclimatic zone. We did it in 2 agroclimatic zones. And it's just not about farmers wanting to transition from conventional agriculture to Akkadi Salu on what they will do every single month, but also on how do you include panchayats, how do you talk to KVKs, and the state government every single month on the various aspects of Akdi Salu and create a demand from the bottom of the pyramid. And this was Akdi Salu. And one telling picture, which I thought I should have put here, was from our experience. I'm sure all of us would have experienced it, but again, a picture from last week during a visit to Kolar. Kolar is a rain-fed, it's very close to Bangalore, but it's a rain-fed district. On seeds, about 12 different varieties of seeds in the foreground of a community of farmers in a village. And 80% of people in that village would be scheduled tribes, the Nayaka communities, and 20% would be Dalit. So there's no one else in that particular village. And all of them are marginal farmers or small farmers at the most. Now, none of the farmers were able to identify more than half the seeds in front of them. And greens as well as millets. And ironically, all these seeds, all these crops were native to that area. So this is as much, or this, the hegemonizing of the mind is as much core to rural distress as we see today, along with the other characteristics of what we call rural distress at the national level. So based on that, I have just 6 slides on my observation of your work. I would want to be part of this going forward. So if you can just go to the next slide, which is about PGS's own goals. I mean, if you look at the PGS's own goals from a policy perspective, all these very ambitious goals put in one sentence, right? I mean, so from a policy lens, if you actually, split that particular sentence and try to understand it from various perspectives, we are looking at a socially, ecologically, and economically just food systems. From the time of the advent of agriculture, there has never been a socially just, environmentally sustainable, and economically viable food system from the advent of agriculture. And we were discussing, Vishala and I were discussing that as a matter of fact, people before the advent of nutrition were supposed to be much more nourished, well nourished than from the time of agriculture. Yeah, and so there is no romanticization of the past, and yet there are things for us to learn from the past. So can we take this as an ideal and a pursuit rather than a lived past, lived glorious past? So that, of course, and it's just not about what happened so far, but it also about contemporary, as Bablu was mentioning, and you also during your introductory talk on what is happening today. So you can see that there is a social de-evolution of this. Because you would assume that going forward, the government will ensure that there are policies which would make it much more socially just, environmentally sustainable, and economically viable. But if you analyze the policies over a period of, let's say, 6 or 7 decades, including now, you can see a de-evolution rather than a progression from a policy perspective. So these words have to be defined before they are well advocated and they become policy, state policies and national policies. And there's also intersectionality there, because we cannot really generalize the peasant population. Absolutely not. And it's just not about rain-fed farmers versus irrigated farmers. Even the peasant movements in India are largely led by communities, leaders who come from dominant communities or who come from irrigated areas. And then you say guaranteed by trust and participation. It is essentially the subsidiarity principles of policy making, which just doesn't exist. Subsidiarity principle would actually mean that the last or the smallest unit of decision making has to be encouraged. Which state in India is doing that? Which state in India is encouraging the smallest unit of governance, rural governance, voice their opinion and be part of a planning process? So this would actually, I mean, if you put this, the antonyms of it would actually lead us to our own policy making processes. So we go with subsidiarity principles and social equity and the rest. Driven by traditional ecological knowledge systems, where knowledge systems themselves overbearing concepts, knowledge systems. So, who's creating that knowledge system? Because, people who work for farmers today, the government, the companies, the academicians, as well as NGOs, are making more money than farmers themselves, right? So where is that knowledge system created, and how, the dynamics of how that knowledge system goes around as traveling rationality, standardization, traveling rationality. So what happens to the knowledge of the local farmers, the knowledge of local farmers? Co-owned and controlled by communities, this is actually an economic ideology, Vishala, right? And are we promoting it as an economic ideology? Because as the owners of not just the produce, but the mode of production, right, and the assets, it's an economic ideology. So can PGS's goals be achieved in the current economic ideological context is something that we may have to look at. And of course, adhering to the principles of cooperation. And this goes to the preambulary principles of fraternity. When I say preambulary, I'm talking about the Constitution. And I'm sure you know that fraternity had to be forced into the Constitution. The Constitution, the Parliament, the Constituent Assembly at that particular time were more bothered about unity in diversity, this general slogan of unity in diversity. So fraternity was actually, was an afterthought because it was being pushed by a certain progressive group of people, including Ambedkar, right? And that fraternity is also about caste system and the social structures, etc., right? So the next one, please. Yeah. And if you look at the spirit of the time and how it is influencing the norms and policies today, the zeitgeist as we call it in an agricultural perspective, it's not even neoliberalism today. Yeah, I mean, you can very clearly see how systematically policies are broken down, to make way for a certain, economic ideology, a social ideology, whether it is in urban governance or in rural livelihood issues. Yeah. Now, for example, financialization of, or commoditization and financialization of land in urban areas, and how that policy of commoditization of land will start influencing every policy in urban areas. Likewise in the rural hinterlands. So hypercapitalism, which is about a social reorganization that's marked by speed, intensity and flow. So where are the farmers in it? My concern really is about that. Where are the farmers in this speed, intensity and flow? And then the depreciating agency of farmers. It's really not just about these three laws. The agency of farmers, the insecurity that they live in is comparatively much more severe today than it was probably a little earlier. Much more severe, which means I'm not saying that they lived a secure life earlier. So that agency in terms of voice of farmers talking about their own livelihood is definitely an issue that we need to look at. And the nationalism endemic, it's an endemic, and that national endemic is characterized by the celebration of three major entities: militarization, number one, corporatization, number two, and heroes, political heroes and icons. So in this grand narrative of nationalism, which is endemic across the world, I wouldn't say pandemic because there are still some countries which are experimenting to deepen democracy, but endemic to a large number of countries, including India. Where are the farmers in this process of the military, the corporate icons, and political leaders or heroes being created? And the voice of the farmers will be drowned in this process, and we are seeing that today. And obviously, we've got the Anthropocene and the hothouse Earth. And I do not know how many of us here in this room have also heard of the hothouse Earth. And it's one of the most recent findings of climate change. And very briefly go to that in the next slide. Yeah. So very quickly, these three slides. One, of course, would be the planetary boundaries. If you look at the Anthropocene and the hothouse Earth, you see that of the 9 boundaries that have been identified, which are leading to climate change, which is also part of it, 5 are directly related to agriculture. Directly related to agriculture. Yeah. So it's one, of course, it's livelihood, but it's also about the kind of livelihood that we have created. So you can see biosphere integrity, land use change, fresh water use, biogeochemical flows, and novel entities. All these are directly related to agriculture. I'll talk about why planetary boundaries are important. I've just got 2 more slides. And these are having, these are impacting what is called the tipping points, which you also know of. Now, of the 11 tipping points, the Indian monsoon is right there. It's always been a bellwether indicator to the planet's health. But today, with the kind of climate change that is happening, we cannot even fathom the impact that it is going to have on our farmers. And all of us have tried our bit in farming. Bablu has been on this for almost 4 decades. In my own small piece of land, 78,000 rupees were spent. I got 7,000 rupees because of excessive rains. Just at the time we had to harvest. This was Akkadi Salu. And if I had only farming as my livelihood, yeah, that's the crisis that is staring at us. And in a manner, I may not understand it because it is not subjective to me, because I can always, offset it with the other things that I do. But this is the crisis. Now, in climate change itself, there are 3 levels of knowledge, and we are quickly slipping into what is called the 3rd level. The first level is we know what is happening and we know why it is happening. Scientists say this is happening and this is why it is happening. The second is we are identified what has happened. We do not know what is happening. We are in the process of understanding it. The third is we do not even know what will happen because of climate change. So science is losing its ground vis-a-vis climate change because we are slipping more into, we cannot ever say again, we had this window of opportunity the last 10 years where we said from 2008 actually, where scientists could say that, look, we know what is happening, so let's do something. And that time has passed now, we do not know what is happening, right? So the third, of course, the third picture is about the hothouse Earth. You can very clearly see that the normal glacial, interglacial cycle of about 1 lakh years. So the last ice age was just 11,000 years ago, just 11,000 years ago. And, it goes through its normal cycle. We've got another 89,000 years to go before, the world cools down again, the planet cools down again. The Earth has already slipped out of its natural cycle. And it essentially has to be pulled back into its normal, it has to be pulled back into its normal cycle, and hence it is called the governed Earth phase. Governed Earth phase. So we are governing the Earth, so we need stewardship, and what you do, through this network is also a kind of stewardship which could be scaled up, much more. Because if you look at the picture that Bablu also projected, India is in dark red. in terms of this network strength. But in terms of actual numbers, it says more than 5,000. More than 5,000 in Indian terms would actually mean nothing. So how do we scale these networks up towards convergence and stewardship for us to get this Earth back into its normal orbit? Very clearly, the indications are that if we do not do that, there is all chances of the Earth going completely barren. This is not just the dominant species dying off, which might actually be good for the planet, but all the lives, all lives on Earth dying. So they are saying just like Venus went through this phase of hot house Earth, there's a possibility of us also going through it. The next slide, please. So what does it, from a policy perspective, what does that mean? So when you say, planetary boundaries, they specify precautionary biophysical boundaries. So the kind of agriculture, how do we get out of chemicals? So science is very clear. So the policies of science very clear, but it does not specify societal pathways, which is social and economic policies, right? It's about science. There are policies of science, but the social and economic policies is something that it doesn't. So the societal pathways is not something that the planetary boundaries can predict, because it is about the political will, right? Which is also about adaptive governance in the face of. So where is in the Government of India climate articulation, we do not even use adaptive governance as a term, as a goal, right? Adaptive governance, because our systems are so rigid and there is political expediency, survival the next day, that adaptive governance in urban areas, adaptive governance in rural areas, no, absolutely not. So what is the impact that it will have on rural livelihoods? The next slide, please. So what are the policy asks? First of all, there's a flawed market-based agricultural policies. Market-based agricultural policies, just like market-based policies anywhere, environmental policies, for example, are based on theories which say that, look, you need to incentivize a sector which has positive externality. So if a sector has a positive externality, you need to incentivize it. But what is happening here? The positive externality of farmers, I mean combining the conventional farmers, of course, is food security and nutrition security. Isn't that enough to incentivize that sector? So you use market-based policies to push for changes in the environmental sector, but not in the agriculture sector, because the environmental sector market-based principles will benefit the corporate houses, but you do not use market-based agricultural policies, even the best of it, which is about incentivizing positive externalities. You don't do that with farmers. So there's a very flawed policy outlook as far as this is concerned. And of course, there's this abundance of intermediaries. And if you actually look at it, there is a value chain in other sectors. There are no intermediaries, not as many. There's a value chain. You look at manufacturing, for example. Of course, the smallest company, even there, is exploited, no question. But there's a value chain. But here, instead of a value chain, there are intermediaries. And of course, the market trend, because of hyper-capitalism, is so dynamic. When I say dynamic, I don't say it from a positive viewpoint, but then it is changing so fast, opportunities are being created, and those opportunities are not being able to be accessed by farmers, which is a major issue. And that's essentially why you have this theory called the opportunity cost. So the opportunity cost of farmers not being able to access the dynamic market mechanism is definitely an issue that we need to look at. And of course, the financial resources. I'm not talking about loans. Can farmers hedge their produce today. They cannot, because it's a cycle, right? I mean, they have to dispose their produce immediately for them to survive, because they start with a debt, right? So where is that, which policy, agriculture policy in India talks about not providing loans, but for farmers to decide? Look, I'm not even talking about nutrition security and food security. I'm talking about farmers as manufacturers of this good called food, right? So can they hedge? Can they wait for a good market? What are the facilities that they have? Especially their own financial status. So what are the policies that we have for it? Of course, storage and movement is something that I don't want to talk about. And the very flawed rural industrialization policies. Now, where in India do you have rural industrialization, at scale, which adds value to the existing livelihood of farmers in villages? Where? Right? And also, as you said, owned by farmers themselves. If you just go east beyond Chittoor, you can see huge mango pulp, companies, and all of them huge. I mean, if you just look at the campus of these, there are hundreds of acres, all headed by some political leader or the other. Even if you assume that mango pulp making factories would be useful, they are not owned by the farmers themselves. But most other industrialization industries in rural areas are not related to agriculture at all. And of course, graft and corruption I did not talk about. The last slide, of course. I mean, I feel that there's an organic paradox, right? And that organic paradox is that, organic farming is a dogma that we are imposing. And I wouldn't, I believe in it. I do believe in it. But it becomes a dogma, or it remains a dogma, unless that particular practice, which we think is environmentally sustainable, socially just, and economically viable, actually accrues as profits for farmers. And unless that happens, and the PGS is also around for that. I mean, Akshay Kalpa is doing that. He's not around now. They are doing that through a company. But again, just look at the scale of the company. Great efforts, but a small group of farmers, right? So it remains a dogma, and I call it the organic paradox in India. So I think I feel these could probably help us, think through this slightly differently from earlier on. Thank you.